Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much to our ASCL Cymru team for hosting this webinar and opening it up to everybody, whether you're an ASCL member watching us live now or anybody who chooses to watch the video later on. Really grateful. We've got a great panel today talking about something which we probably should have been talking about a lot in the past, and maybe some people were. It's suddenly become a big focus for everybody, and particularly if you're in a school in Wales at the moment, in the week that more young people are starting to come back into school in a very distinctive, very ambitious way. I think it's a very timely moment to talk about blended learning and how do we make sure that the experience in the classroom connects one way or another with the experience that a child might have at home. And I think what we'll particularly be saying today is this really isn't just narrowly about technology, it's about pedagogy, it's about learning. And we want to make that work for children of all backgrounds. So that kind of frames what we're doing. The format today is largely what we're going to ask each of our panelists to do is introduce themselves and then to talk you through some of their ideas. And the rest of us will disappear while they're doing that, and I'll just come back and link those together. But through all of that, you send us any questions, comments, disagreements, points of clarification, heckles, digital heckles, whatever it might be. And towards the end of this, what we'll do is to put some of those to the panelists, and if we can't answer any of those, we'll put them together into a frequently asked question. So that's the format. All I'm really doing is hosting. So let's introduce our panel. Let's start with Ethna Hughes, our Director of ASCL Cymru. Good afternoon, Ethna Hughes. How are you?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm very well, thank you. And thank you to everybody for tuning in at the end of a very long day. Just briefly to introduce myself, Irish accent, but I'm the Director for ASCL in Wales. And basically that my job is to represent members, of course, and to work very closely with the middle tier, which is fairly cluttered in Wales. I won't list them all because we'll be here all day. But local authorities and consortia are among the key players here, as well as working closely with Welsh Government on policy and strategy. So that is who I am. Thank you.
And we'll come back to Ethna in a minute just to frame the context for the discussion. So Ethna, see you in just a second. So we've got Matthew Pullen here. Matthew, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Hi, so I currently work at the University of South Wales, work as a senior lecturer in teacher education on the undergraduate programme. My background, I was a PE teacher for 12 years and I suppose just started to think about what teaching could look like outside of the traditional, which has led me to explore different approaches in how we can support students, blended learning obviously being one of those things. Aside from that, I am an independent consultant in ed technology as well, so support schools both in Wales but further afield as well in how pedagogy supports technology and therefore supports the learners.
Excellent, thank you very much. Talking of further afield, we've got Helen Newies here. Helen, tell us a little bit about your role and who you work with.
Yes, so I work at GCSE Pod. I'm one of the directors there. We are a platform that really very much is set up for blended learning. We're a digital online platform, and I spend my days very happily working with schools to understand how they use blended learning already, what their objectives might be, barriers and obstacles that might be getting in the way, and supporting them both through the content that we offer, but also through sort of coaching methods to encourage school leaderships to incorporate more blended learning into their everyday teaching. So we've been doing this for 10 years and we're really thrilled that one of the benefits, and thankfully there have been a few positives of these last months, although there has been many negatives, is that there is now more talk of use of blended learning in teaching and learning, and we're ready to help.
Excellent, thank you. And next we're moving into a school, Crickhowell High School, where we've got Hannah O'Farrell and Alison Hand, and they are socially distancing, but they're both going to contribute. So Hannah, do you want to introduce yourself, and then across to you, Alison?
Yeah, sure. I'm Hannah O'Farrell, assistant head teacher at Crickhowell High School, former head of English in the school, and responsible for teaching and learning.
And I'm Alison Hand, also an assistant head teacher at Crickhowell High School, former head of maths, and I've got a responsibility towards student achievement.
Great, well, thank you. Thanks to all of you on the panel this afternoon. I'm going to ask you to disappear from here unless you happen to be Ethna Hughes, because I'm going to hand over to our Director of ASCL Cymru to frame the discussion, and then we'll come to Matthew after that. So Ethna, over to you.
Oh, hi everybody. Right, the frame of the discussion in Wales, I think here we have a very unique opportunity to do something very different and very exciting to where we were before lockdown. Essentially, the structures that have been set up by Welsh Government, I think, really do support a radical rethink of how we educate our learners at whatever age they are in their travelling through the system. This webinar on blended learning, as Jeff said at the very beginning, let's be clear, it's not about technology, it's not about kit, it's not about software, it has to be about learning. And it's about a learning programme that can be put together that is relevant to learners in the 21st century, not something that was relevant in a post-industrial society that we haven't managed to move away from. So to give you a flavour as to what this could become, I'm going to cite some work by Michael Fullan. You will know his work, I'm sure. He's currently engaged on a global cross-jurisdiction research project on deepening learning through new pedagogies. Now, pre-COVID, Michael Fullan describes the engagement of our children right across those 14 jurisdictions as being this. 20% of learners, he says, were fully engaged and understood the value of education and what they needed to do to progress. 40% of learners pre-COVID wanted to engage with the system, but found that the system prohibited that engagement. And the remaining 40% of learners are alienated from the system as a consequence of multiple vulnerabilities. But something interesting has happened during this COVID crisis in the last 3 months. In the research that Fullan has done, that 20% of learners remain fully engaged, but 40% who wanted to be engaged are now actually switching on to learning as a consequence of a more interesting, vibrant and relevant use of technology through a hybrid approach to learning. Sadly, the remaining 40% who were disengaged and alienated are even more distant from education. So Fullan's argument here is that we need to at least hold on to the 60% of learners who are now engaging fully or indeed emerging in their engagement into the system and not go back to the traditional menu of delivery pre-COVID. So the challenge is for us to actually shake off the status quo, which I know is a huge cultural shift for many. So the infrastructure and support that we have here in Wales, I think, does give us an opportunity to really engage our learners and do something radical and different. There's been a huge investment, some £50 million have been invested on supporting a digital infrastructure. And for those of you in Wales who don't know this, our local authorities are actually currently in receipt of 27 million of that 50, it's the last of it, which is earmarked for the use of digital technology. And it's to help teaching and learning for schools across the countries. So we need to be aware that that spend is happening and people need to knock on the door of local authorities to say, right, this is what I want. And it's not, as I say, about kit, it's about what you want for your learners, that will support, that technology will support. So I think that's vitally important. So the question is this is the challenge. What do you want your schools to become that we have learned during this recovery phase, moving into a transitional phase, and then moving into something more long-term and more sustainable? What is it that you want for your youngsters? Surely it's not just sitting in a classroom facing the front, it's doing something very, very different indeed. I think, and I'm nearly finished, we are at what Gladwell calls a tipping point, and it's up to us to make the best of this moment. We also have in Wales a curriculum that's been put together that's beginning to emerge, which is called a continuity of learning plan. And there's a blended learning outline programme to support that. And we have a hub, which is a platform set up in order to make sure that all children have got accessibility across the country. Now, many use it and some don't, but it is there. And I think what it demonstrates is a will by government to actually make this happen. So if we have a will as leaders and practitioners, and government has a will to do this, this is the time to actually, for us to step up and make this happen. So the purpose of this webinar is to stimulate thinking about what it is that we want to achieve from this period of disruption, moving into learning and recovery in a way that is more relevant and engaging. And let's think big about this, and let's get something different for our youngsters. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ethno. I think what I like particularly about all of that is that what you referenced there is, first of all, a curriculum which is in itself pretty innovative, isn't it? It's trying to do bold things there, and I know that's an ongoing process, but you've got a government which has said we're going to do this properly and give it time. So it doesn't look like that what we're suddenly doing is on the back foot, thinking, right, what can we do with technology to supplant that or to match in? That's been part of the thinking about what does a 21st century learner look like. And when you reference hubs there, just for those people who aren't familiar, can you just in a sentence or two just give us a flavour of what that means, the hub concept?
Yeah, I think the hub concept is one where you would have learners who are grouped together in schools currently under this particular provision for key workers. So you'll have different operational structures around that. But that hub arrangement has been really interesting because it's mixed together different age groups of children, which isn't necessarily the shape of the system in Wales. So that again has given a fresh impetus into the system as to how to modify what we're doing to try and cope with that range of learners that are there. So yes, we've got a lot of exciting things going on in Wales with digital leadership being at the core of the new curriculum that we wish to develop as a strategic, forward-thinking plan for the country.
Perfect. That's perfect cue to invite Matthew to join us on screen. So Matthew, as you said, having stepped from a role in teaching into looking at teaching partly in your university role and then connecting that in terms of schools, this whole trend towards digital is a particular interest of yours. So can we hand over to you to kind of talk us through some of those ideas?
Yeah, perfect. Let me just grab my screen a second. Okay. So thank you, Jeff. So my role, like I said, is at the University of South Wales, where I support future teachers. And I suppose that journey started about 4 years ago when I joined, specifically to have a look at what technology meant. We knew that the digital competence framework was on the horizon. I'd worked with schools previous to this as part of the consortia to look at, what that might mean for learning beyond ICT as a subject. And it kind of leads me to think then from a pedagogical point of view about what blended learning could mean for the future, but not only because of COVID and a response to COVID, but actually as an approach to change things. As Etna mentioned before, I think we now have an opportunity to really redefine what learning looks like in Wales and how technology can potentially provide a new landscape for us. Having done some reading around this, I'm a big fan of creativity. I suppose being a PE teacher, I saw how practical activity could develop learning in different ways. And this comes from a Gallup survey, which talks about 81% of teachers saying that transformative use of technology really does help students connect their learning with the real world. And we know that in Wales, one of the main things that we're looking for is authentic learning experiences for our students so that it can help make sense for them in their local surroundings. I'm sure everybody is familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. And I think at the moment, too much that we do as educators sits at this low level in terms of the curriculum, meaning that we don't have time to go much further than just asking our children to remember and understand. And we know that the great teachers, the great schools, the great educators really want to strive to have more time with their learners, to push them further up and to get to the pinnacle where, although this looks like a pyramid and it goes upwards, we really want to discuss about deeper learning and that learning is embedded and enhances how they can operate as 21st century individuals going into the workplace. And when we look at creativity at the very pinnacle of this, we're not talking about just asking students to be creative, but we're asking them to do something different with the learning that they take on board. And by producing new or original work gives them the idea that it's not just about learning content, it's about what we do with the content to make a difference in the world. And I think COVID's probably opened up people's eyes here to a problem which nobody has the solution to. And there's an opportunity to position this for our students, to get them to think about a world where they have just as much right to field the answers to the current problems that are going on as the politicians do, because this is so new for everybody. And I think that's really what we want to be doing as educators in the classroom with our students. You may or may not be familiar with the SAMR model as well. This is more specific to technology, and I'll just quickly run through it. The S stands for substitution. This is where we take what we currently do and we use technology as a direct substitute for that. For instance, as we move online, it might be that we start to think about, well, this is how I would have taught in the classroom, and I'll just do it via a webcam. And although that is a use, that is a way of utilizing the technology to drive things forward, it really is just a substitute for what you did. We can then look at how we might augment that operation and where we can develop the functional improvement. For instance, in this webinar, we have a chat window. If you were a shy person in the classroom and didn't want to talk out in front of your teachers, the benefit of doing video conferencing is I now have a chat window and I have a voice, even though I don't have to verbally speak. I have a place where I can share my thoughts and ideas without that fear of somebody not agreeing with me or me embarrassing myself. These sit at an enhancement level. So the technology provides an enhancement to what we currently do. But we want to kind of move that forward. And I think, as Etna alluded to before, we've got a tipping point here where we can actually make a difference. So if we move on to the M, which is modification, this is where we can actually start to redefine the things we're doing. And I suppose blended learning starts to fit into this position. I'll talk about autonomy a little bit later, but the very nature of students being directors of their own time, being directors of their own task, and how they complete those tasks can actually engage students in a very different way. And then finally, what's usually labeled as the pinnacle of this, but I don't think it's meant to be viewed as a ladder where we always strive for the very end, because there's always a place for substitution, but redefinition, where we can actually consider a new approach. How does technology change what we currently do to allow new learning opportunities? How do we capture those 40% and maintain them? And is there anything that extra we could do for that 20% that have disengaged already? And this is where we see that transformation. So going back to the 81%, this is the difference that teachers are seeing in terms of how students engage with the world around them. I'm sure we can all agree that children all over the world at the moment have seen learning opportunities that might not have existed within the school time. They might not be led by teachers to do many of these opportunities. I've seen children become chefs. I've seen children become gardeners. I've seen children learn all new skills because they chose to learn those things and they had access to a way to learn them. So these are the 4 T's of autonomy. If you've not read Daniel Pink's book Drive, it's great. It's about motivation. And just to summarize just one of the elements is that we naturally want to be autonomous. We naturally want to be driven by our own innate desire to get better. And these are the 4 T's. When we have choice over our task, what we do, then we will engage more deeply in what we're actually trying to achieve. When we change the time or give ownership over the time that I do it, again, we can structure things differently. My own son sometimes is great working at 9 o'clock in the morning, sometimes he's not. If I push him to do the work at 9 o'clock every single day, actually it leads to arguments. And what we found is if we know how he works and if he knows how he works, he ends up actually being a lot more productive if he works when he knows he's switched on to something. Technique, which is important, how you actually complete the task. I think the days of asking all students to write things in books because that's the way we did it have started to change. And I think that's a role that technology can play in providing choice and option to allow accessibility for our learners so they can provide the information in a way that suits their needs. And finally, team, who they work with. One thing I have definitely learned over this last 3 months is that experts are everywhere. And actually, as an individual, I don't need to be the expert in my own class. But what I do need to know is where those experts exist. I have learned so much over the last 3 months by joining in webinars such as this that might be hosted by people all over the world. And if I can learn in that way, then so can my students. I, for one, as a lecturer in university, have started to consider how I can engage those experts from around the world, because we have got so used to using online tools such as webinars, to actually support my future teachers and to drive them to think slightly differently about their approach. So how might new pedagogies and new technologies transform the learning. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this idea of the sage on the stage, the old-fashioned approach that we stand there and we deliver content. And that's started to move towards the guide on the side, the fact that we don't necessarily lead from the front, but we offer students opportunities to learn for themselves. And this actually comes from Michael Fullan's exploration around, which one works, do they work? And actually some of his research is starting to lead to the fact that actually neither of them are completely productive for everybody. As we should know, diversity is fantastic. So actually having an active approach as the educator where we learn with our students, and it's refreshing to see that there's so much within Wales's new curriculum that talks about this idea of co-teaching, co-delivery and co-construction of the learning, and actually having the teacher as somebody who can recognise that a student might just need some support, but can actually go and find some information for themselves and dive deeper into the learning. But other students might need that prompt. I take World War II for an example. You might introduce that to a group of students and some of them absolutely love it, have read all about it, have a huge interest in it, and actually they want to get stuck in and find out more. Other students might not really be that interested, so therefore the role of the teacher might be to inspire them and to get them interested. But then you also have the opportunity that that student who knows so much about World War II is actually the teacher in the classroom. And you as the teacher might take the role as a learner in this instance, because you might find out they know a lot more than you. So what we're doing is developing the skills of the individuals to want to learn more, as opposed to just what they learn. Here's a very brief example. So this is something that I've been doing with my son at the moment, just to support him with his maths. And through using technology to help make videos that he can watch over and over again, he then has choice in terms of his level that he engage on, in terms of, do I think I struggle with this, or do you think I can push myself further? But then finally, he has to demonstrate his learning back to me in a way that suits his creativity. Does he make a video to teach me something? Does he create a poster that shows his understanding? I'm not going to ask him to write it down, because ultimately that might just show the outcome. What I want to see is the process. And though throughout all this, he has a personalized learning approach. He gets to choose his point of engagement. He gets to choose the additional support he might need or not need. But all the time, he knows where he wants to go next with his learning. So just very simply, the overview and the role technology can help. It does provide access for all learners. We know that technology provides access in the way you can read along with the text, have the text read to me, use video so that I can see things instead, closed caption, I could use music, I could use video, I can use all sorts of things. It also allows those students through creativity to express themselves in a way that suits them. It might be drawing, video, audio and text, but this is the end point. This is the point where the teacher can then engage to see where any misconceptions might be. I noted in the last example that creation of video allows the process to be repeated as often as the learner needs. So that student that might not engage in the classroom because they're too shy to say that they didn't understand it the first time can now in their own time push play on that video and check their own understanding. The mobile nature of devices allows that application to apply to the real world around them. So if they are asked to explore something, they can go outside, they can move around the space, and they're not fixed to a table with a computer in front of them. And then if we want to really drive things forward, we focus on how to learn and not just simply what to learn. So if we're meeting the needs of the learners, we should consider that we're thinking about personalized learning, that we embed creativity into what they do, we enhance their communication with not just the teacher and their peers, but who else can become an expert, that we ask them to consider teamwork as something which is going to hugely change their approach. If we look at Vygotsky's zones of proximal development, we know that there are other people in that classroom who can support them. And then finally, that element of real world engagement. So we know that the internet and collaboration may give us access to the world, but it's also a visual link to the world around them as well. So thinking about how technology can change your approach, blended learning is just one way that we can start to think differently about what education might look like in Wales.
Matthew, great, really interesting. Thank you. And what I like about that is quite often the whole debate around technology in this strange world has been about advantage and disadvantage. Or it's been about, well, why can't teachers just have Zoom calls and talk at students? And your starting point is essentially around learners. And you probably know that ASCL has had a relationship with Apple for a couple of years now. One of the things that made me look at is things that would sometimes leave children on the margins. Suddenly technology brings them in as learners, even something as simple as being able to make the text larger for themselves, or getting the text to be read out to themselves. The children who would have needed a teaching assistant, the technology can make all of that much more straightforward and much more inclusive. And I think what you're saying about the shy kid who wouldn't be able to contribute verbally actually can put their comment there. I think it's really empowering model there. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. We'll come back with any questions that we get later on. Let's ask Helen Newies to join us now from GCSE Pod. Hiya, Helen.
Hello there.
You've been rooted in this world, haven't you, for a while? So let's get your perspective in terms of what you've been doing through GCSE Pod.
Thank you. Let me just make sure that I'm showing you the right screen here.
Yeah.
There we go. And I'll move all of my bits over here. I'm going to turn my video off actually, just because it gets in the way of my screen, and probably yours as well. There we go. So yes, I'm going to look a little bit at what's changing with blended learning. As you said, Jeff, it is something that we've been looking at for the last decade, but now that lockdown has happened, I think there are changes and benefits that could be moved into more long-term solutions. What are the challenges facing schools and teachers, and what is working well? So because we work with so many schools, hopefully I can give some best practice on what is working well and how maybe to implement that in your school. And this is an example of what can happen when blended learning does work well. This is Eve, who's a deputy head, and she says through blended learning, their students have become more independent. Their digital literacy has improved, which is obviously fantastic for going into the world of work. They are more metacognitive in their approach to learning, and they've developed self-regulation as well. And Matthew, I thought it was really fascinating what you were saying about your son and the way that he's learning at times of day when he's interested and engaged. And actually, because we have so many of hundreds of thousands of students accessing our content each day, we can map engagement with digital technology and see how it's changed pre and post lockdown. So this is how usage on our site looked before the lockdown. So as you can see, the students are fitting their independent study around school day, and that is meaning that they're doing a huge amount of their independent learning at the end of the day, quite late at night. And we have to ask ourselves as educators, is that the optimal time for them to be learning? And also, is it by choice, or is it because they don't have any other choice? And so if we look at how that pattern changes when we move to the lockdown phase and it's full-on blended learning, we see that it wasn't choice. And actually, if we overlay those two graphs, we can see that we've got rid of that evening spike entirely. And actually, the students, just like your son, sometimes the students are electing to work at 10 o'clock in the morning is actually the peak. And Matthew, I just quickly wrote down, students are directors of their own time. I hope I haven't misquoted you, but that's what can happen with blended learning, is that students can be working at times when they're most engaged, they're most productive. And again, that's preparing them for the world of work, where evening, hopefully not all of us are working too many evenings, and it's better for their well-being as well if they're doing that learning during the times when they're most able to be productive. So what does that blended learning actually look like from a practical perspective? Well, James says what they do is they identify relevant quality learning materials and they provide those to the students in advance of a lesson. Now, that might be a face-to-face lesson, or it might be an online lesson. What they then do is use the teaching time to deepen that learning. So essentially, they're providing the student with core knowledge and understanding independently, and then they're building on that in contact time and lesson time with their teacher. And that means that the lessons become shorter, they're more enjoyable for the students. The students are chatting, sharing ideas, and they're more motivated as well. The lessons become interactive and they become more productive. And we did a study, we actually did a survey of our teacher community, and 800 people responded, and we asked them, how comfortable do you feel about blended learning continuing to be a permanent fixture as we move forward? And it was hugely positive. 85% of teachers said, yeah, absolutely, we think this would be something we're very comfortable with. And yet when we asked them, okay, so to what extent do you think blended learning will continue to be part of school life? The answer was much less confident. Lots of teachers, about 1 in 3, said that they expected things just to revert back to face-to-face. So the question is, if our teachers are confident with blended learning and they like the idea of using it more, why are they expecting it to fall backwards, if you like, when schools start to reopen? And I think the answer might be that there's not enough space available to them to do that blended learning, much like a student who is having to force all of their independent learning at to a certain time of day. If we can create space for blended learning for teachers, then it can thrive in our schools. So I'm going to go through a few top tips, if you like, based on my experience working with schools. And the first one is to reduce cognitive load, to consolidate the platforms that you're using to maybe 2 or 3 key platforms. So rather than having, you learn science over here and your mark books are over here and you do your marking on this platform, which can be overwhelming and really switch off both teachers and students, is to say, which of the platforms do we have cover the broadest range of our subjects and the broadest range of our activities? So can we have one homework platform? Is there one place which is particularly good for students to test out their knowledge, for example, and consolidate into those resources? The second one is to emulate the procedure of blended learning when you do have that contact time. So if you've got students that are not confident learners at home, they're not confident independent learners, what Sarah says here, who is a teacher at King's Priory, is the key is to embed online resources into daily teaching. Show the students what it means to watch a video and make notes on it, or to transform the information into something new, and make that feel part of a normal lesson. So you normalize blended learning in the classroom so that when you start to introduce it more fully, students are confident that they know what you expect from them when you're not physically in the same room as them. And what Sarah says that is through this experience, they've found that students have fewer technological problems and they're not avoiding work at home. The third one, and Matthew really touched on this too, is don't just look for technology, but look for strong pedagogy within the online learning platforms that you might be using or interested in using. First of all, the technology needs to back up the teacher. It shouldn't be a drain on their time. So make sure it integrates with any MIS systems that you're using, so your classes are imported. If it's got single sign-on, that's even better. Save students remembering extra passwords, and make sure the data can be extracted easily. And then start to ask questions around pedagogy. Does the platform that you're using have content that's quality assured? Who is writing it? Where is it coming from? And is it exam board specific? If you can get good quality content, either produced by yourself or bought in elsewhere, it will give teachers confidence to use blended learning more. And actually, there was a study done very recently by the Education Endowment Fund, and they echoed this advice. They said, make sure that whatever platforms you're using have effective teaching practices built in. So look for things like scaffolded feedback systems, clear and consistent explanations if students are being asked to answer questions online. And again, Matthew, you talked about deeper thinking, and one of the things that we see with our platform and students using our content is that they're using it as a springboard to then transform their knowledge into something brand new. They're not just sitting there answering question after question, which is repetitive and boring and can also be unproductive time. Instead, they're doing that deeper thinking, they're stretching their knowledge, and they're being creative as well and giving them that opportunity. So one student might do a revision poster, another student might storyboard a video that they want to create, just like you did with your son, Matthew. The fourth one is to encourage the uptake of blended learning by reducing workload. It shouldn't increase workload, it should actually reduce it if it's done properly. Eve said here, ensure that within your department there's a culture of collaboration and sharing. So often Eve goes into schools as a consultant and sees departments working in silos where they're producing the same types of resources over and over again. So look for platforms that allow teachers to collaborate easily, even if they're not physically together. So maybe online sharing platforms where they can add lessons and then share that amongst themselves. And of course, take that one step further and identify and look for ready-made assignments or ready-made content that you can buy in to support your teachers and supplement any materials that they're having to create. They shouldn't be having to reinvent the wheel. There is an enormous amount of fantastic high quality content out there that you can provide your teachers with and give them a really, really good head start. Avoid email at all costs. We talk to our schools a lot about training. How can you train teachers to be more effective at blended learning? And the feedback we get time and time again is do as much as possible to avoid email. Talk to your IT department, see if they could use a free resource like Screencastify, where teachers can actually record 1-2 minute snippets of how to do different things. So if your teachers constantly forget how to log into Google Classroom, get your IT department to do a 1-minute video that they can watch if they forget. And of course, as Matthew said, there are so many fantastic webinars being run at the moment where you can learn from, completely for free. And many of the platforms that you might purchase or use for blended learning offer those for free. So make sure that your teachers are benefiting from those and engaging with them. We've run about 100 webinars in the last six weeks or so. We've had about 8,000 teachers take part. So it's a really good way to upskill. And then lastly, understand and maintain the gains that have come from this lockdown period. There's been a lot of negative impact, but there have been positives. And Eve again says here, their focus now as a school is on building a virtual world of learning. They're not going to just suddenly go back to face and abandon everything they've worked so hard to achieve. So retain the gains is a key message from schools we're speaking to. And some of those gains may be unexpected. If you provide your teachers with more flexible working, maybe reduce their workload by adding in things like self-marking tools, you may actually look at improving teacher retention and helping to solve another national crisis that we're facing. So I would just leave you with this question. How can your school benefit from blended learning? And hopefully there are a few benefits that you've already got from this period that you can continue into the future as well.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. And what I like about that is that the notion of blended starts to become very clear to us. It's partly blending what a child might be working on at home, not seeing that as divided from what they might be doing in the classroom, but actually there's some stuff which perhaps they're better off doing at a different time at home, but which then merges with what they're doing in the classroom. But also I think lots of people, there'll be a kind of national hurrah at the idea of let's get rid of the tyranny of emails and find other ways to see this fundamentally as kind of professional development for teachers and other staff working with young people. We're getting lots of questions in now. So what I'm going to do is to ask Hannah and Alison, who are assistant heads from Crickhowell High School, to join me. They're going to talk about some of the things that they're doing in their school. Then we'll bring all the panel back here. Get your questions coming in now. I'm curating those behind the scenes, and there's a whole range of different things you're saying. I won't identify you individually other than your first name or where you are, and you can tell us, whatever you do, whatever your perspective is. Very grateful to have those. So here we've got Hannah and Alison. I think Hannah's starting us off here. So over to you two, and thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much. I can just share my screen with you, and we'll switch off the camera as well, just so you can see it more clearly as we talk through the presentation. Okay. So at Crickell High School, we were already on a journey with technology. We already had the use of iPads within the school and Apple TVs in every classroom. We'd also began exploring certain apps, and as Helen said, we have felt as a school that it's so important to focus on particular apps as opposed to overloading staff with many different apps. So we have used in the past, as we approach revision, apps such as Explain Everything. And we had also begun using OneNote in the classroom, especially with our sixth form learners.
Yeah, so with the sixth form, we introduced them to Microsoft Teams, made sure that they could access Microsoft Teams from their own devices, and OneNote in sharing resources and links. We had started before the lockdown to get them to start submitting their work on either OneNote or on assignments, as we will talk about in a little while.
Yeah, so as we approached lockdown 1 week before, and we were in, oh, there you go, just scrolling through. So as we approached lockdown, 1 week before, we began setting up what we referred to as our e-learning, which was essentially our OneDrive in school that staff members started sharing their resources on for our students. Obviously, 1 week before lockdown, we were particularly concerned about our examination classes, and we knew that we wanted to teach online, but we didn't necessarily know to begin with how to do that. Students began from the very first day accessing our e-learning, and Alison will just talk you through what we did just before we got there.
So we recognised the need for both staff and students to be comfortable and confident in using online platforms. We are part of the POWERS collaboration where ASCL is already up and running, and that allows certain schools to deliver certain A-level subjects to a collaboration of schools, and those students are then remote learning. And so we managed to get some members of staff to put on training as to what they had done already to our staff. So we had lunchtimes and after school sessions. We had sessions looking at how we use Teams and OneNote to share learning, how we could incorporate screencasts into our lessons to share material with our students, how within Teams and OneNote we could use the assignments to hand in work and to assess work and to provide feedback for our learners. We looked at using different apps such as Quizlet and Kahoot. We had intensive training on the iPad. So even though we'd had the journey with the iPads, many staff hadn't fully implemented them into their teaching. So in this week before lockdown, we tried to make sure the staff felt comfortable using their iPads to communicate with students. We looked at video conferencing. We looked at using OneDrive and Office 365, setting classwork and homework on Go for Schools, which is our online platform, and how we could use different methods to engage with students. We recognise that a big part of this going forward, as Helen mentioned, was the collaboration and sharing. And so we formed a Microsoft Teams called Using Teams, where all staff could put on tips and advice that they had sort of learned for all the other staff to see. We obviously realised that the students would also need training, so we had screencasts created for them so that they could also follow the guidance as to how to access Teams from home, how to access OneNote, and how to make sure that they could engage with their teachers. We made sure that the appropriate safeguarding protocols were put in place so that our students were safe and our staff were safe in delivering these online lessons. And we realised very early on that using technology would be fundamental in ensuring that our learners engaged and had access to a learning continuum throughout the pandemic.
So as our students, in the first week that they were at home, our students began from the very first day accessing their e-learning, following their timetabled lessons. But at this point, before Easter, they were accessing their learning in 3 different ways. So they had their e-learning platform. They also had Microsoft Teams that was being used by teachers following the training that they'd had, and also work uploaded onto Go for Schools. And Alison, I was just going to talk to you as well about how we developed that.
So thankfully, to a forward-thinking head teacher, we were able to send a survey to parents to assess the amount of students that had access to devices. And so before the lockdown began, we could ensure that all students had access to devices. And we were able to loan out some laptops and some iPads to ensure that their learning could continue. Throughout the first couple of weeks, we recognised that we would need, particularly with our older students, our year 10s and our year 12s, once it became apparent that year 11 and year 13 exams were not going ahead, our focus turned towards our year 10 and our year 12 students, and how could we actually not only just provide information and engage with them, get them motivated in their learning, but how could we ensure that we could feed back as well? So we looked at using Microsoft Teams, where they could hand in assignments that we could then annotate and they could access back. And we looked at them submitting work on the OneNote class note sections, again, where we could then feed back to them.
So after Easter, we then evaluated what we were doing. And we felt that it was very important that rather than using these 3 separate platforms, instead, as Alison mentioned, we focused on the use of Teams and really developed that instead. And as Helen, as you mentioned in your presentation, you know, really focusing on one particular platform that students can use to engage. In addition to that, we also then began to focus on the students who weren't engaging with their e-learning. And the way that we approach that is firstly through our directors of learning, who collated a list of students who were not engaging with their learning online. And then they passed that list onto our progress leaders, who then checked that to see if there was a valid reason for their non-engagement. And then that was a filtered list where we contacted key students, contacted their parents at home to ask if there was anything that we could do to support. That was really important because, you know, it came to light that, you know, some particular students needed access to, you know, dongles to get onto the internet, or it might have been that we had some students who initially hadn't felt that perhaps it was a problem having access to IT, but actually, you know, with having everybody working at home, mum and dad as well, they did in fact need further devices. So that was quite important, that contact home. That's also meant as well for students who've been persistent non-engagers, that during this week now that we've returned to school, those children have been a priority in getting them into school to check that they're okay, and also that they can access their learning and see if there's any additional support they need from a wellbeing perspective. As I said, after Easter, it was felt it was important to ensure that we streamlined what we were doing, mostly focused on Teams, and also have a balance of live and pre-recorded lessons. We also found, obviously, that staff who now were at home trying to work with young children might find it very difficult to teach online live lessons. But what we did there is also encourage our staff to use their time to pre-record lessons and then to upload that to their Teams group alongside any resources that they were using. We also thought as well about reducing teacher workload, because obviously it's very hard if you're looking after your family at home and also you know, teaching at the same time. So to help with that, with year 7 and 8, we moved more towards our project-based learning, and I've put a link there to one of our Adobe Spark projects on Festival. So our project for year 7 and 8, which is very much the ethos of the Curriculum for Wales, were projects on celebration, because we felt that the children needed something very positive after lockdown. So that particular link that you've got there is a project looking at a festival for expressive arts. And then with our year 9 to 11, we have a 3-year GCSE at Crickhouse. So we start our GCSE course when they're in year 9. So the focus there was ensuring that our GCSE students had adequate provision, and also ensuring that we put in place bridging units. So whereas we would have spent a lot of time preparing our students for Key Stage 5, they've missed out on that. So we produced bridging units that went on to Teams for our year 11 students and for year 12 students as they're moving forward to year 13.
So going forward, I'm planning for September. At the moment, it seems like hitting a ball into a moving goal. We've sort of planned for 3 scenarios. So the first scenario is the status quo, and there's no changes to the restrictions. So the plan there is to continue as we are with the blended learning, making sure that all learners have a balance of live and recorded lessons along with independent study via the use of Teams. And as Hannah said, making sure that for every, say, 3 lessons, they have one where they can see the teacher live or have a screencast. The second scenario we're looking at is where there may be some easing of restrictions. So maybe we bring in half the students for 1 week and the other half learn at home during that week, and then the following week they swap places, so that staff can carry on with the blended learning approach while the students are at home, as well as having face-to-face contact with the students that are in school. And scenario 3, which I think everybody really wants, is that all restrictions are lifted and COVID fizzles out. However, what we have acknowledged that during this lockdown, it has been a massive learning curve for our staff. And we don't want them to sort of go back, as Helen insinuated, that maybe 1 in 3 teachers are thinking that they'll just return to normal. And here at Crickhowell, we don't want to return to normal. We want to make sure that we continue on that projection of blended learning, where we're able to combine the technology with a strong pedagogy to ensure that our students receive an education that is essential for a 21st century learner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just switch back.
No, thank you both very much. We're going to invite the whole panel to join us back on the screen. Lots of questions coming in, but Hannah and Alison, just thank you for that, because whilst what you were showing us was very granular stuff that you are doing at Crickhowell High School, the ambition behind it was incredibly significant. So you've got the mixture of, you know, things that some people might have thought were theoretical, but the way you were playing those out in person was great. So lots of questions coming in. I was going to ask each of you just to reflect on what you've heard from other people. To be honest, I'm getting so many questions in, and if you don't mind, I'm just going to put a range of different questions. And the idea here is I'll put 2 or 3 at a time. Feel free to comment on any of them, all of them, none of them, preferably not all of them, actually, each of you, because we just want to try and get through them. So you've got a mix of some people being really positive about it and some people being a little skeptical about it. So David says, well, there was a webinar the tests ran on Monday, and it did a straw poll asking people, has the use of technology improved learning? 69% of people, says David, said no. That surely punctures the mood of optimism here. And at the same time, we've had a number of different comments from Jo, one of which is, she teaches in England, she said, I think that some of the least effective learning that's taken place has been during the limited face-to-face sessions in school. I can honestly say that I know my students better since lockdown. So it would be interesting just to reflect on, are there aspects of a child's learning that have suddenly been released because of this process that you perhaps wouldn't have seen in the classroom, and anything which kind of reassures David that this isn't phony optimism, this is actually opening the way to a more inclusive sense of learning, like I said. That's all one issue, which is around how we help pupils to learn more, how we kind of liberate them. The second one comes from Helen, who says, as a member of an SLT focusing on teaching and learning, how do you monitor the quality of teaching and learning and give feedback to teachers in terms of what they're doing? It's a really interesting and quite a thorny question, I would have thought. So that notion of monitoring the quality, which is an SLT role, would be interesting to get a comment on. And one other question, which comes, I think, from Jo again, which is, has anyone seen or got a parent guide to explain the benefits of blended learning and why it's so effective? Parents tend to be fixated on certain things like live lessons, but they're only part of the solution. So how in a sense, without being patronizing, do we educate parents who will have been educated themselves in a different age about the benefits of this? So we've got 3 things there. One focuses on student learning, one focuses on how we monitor what teachers are doing, one is how we engage with parents and take them with us in all of this. So you just give me an appropriate gesture, remember the word appropriate there, and we'll ask you to comment on it. So we'll start with Helen. Thank you.
So I'll work backwards. I'll start with the parent question. That I completely agree. I think it's so important to get parents to understand what's happening so that when their child is doing work from home, they are understanding what productive work looks like, what effective learning looks like from home. And I agree. I think, you know, it's educating parents on what learning their child might be doing independently versus what learning they might be doing, as you say, from an online lesson. What we've done actually at GCSE Pod is we've ran a series of webinars specifically for parents, and we've seen enormous uptake. We've ran webinars with think the last one we did was about 400 parents. And the feedback that we get after the webinars is that they are very grateful for two things. One, for understanding how they can help, because parents can have a collaborative approach to blended learning with schools, but also they've been beneficial for actually learning the content themselves. And we've been offering parents access to our platform, not to help their child, but actually so that they can learn about the subject area. And we've had an awful lot of people requesting that, so that they can say, well, I want to learn how maths is taught now so that I can help my child better, so that they are sending the same key messages to the child, so that they're not confusing them at home. The other thing was about monitoring quality of teaching, and it is worth looking at other platforms that are available where, say a department head can actually look at the marking that another teacher has done. So rather than necessarily having to go physically and ask them, can I see your books or your jotters, and can I review the marking, using online marking and online assessment means that teachers and department heads can do that from a distance and actually monitor the quality of feedback given to students digitally. So actually moving to online marking can support that. It doesn't necessarily have to detract from that monitoring. So yeah.
Thank you. Helen, Matthew next.
Yeah, just to kind of jump in on the back of that, really valid point. I think, Helen, you also talked about reducing teacher workloads when you were talking before, and I think one of the valid things is, I think as educators, I know when I was an educator, we would go through an exercise of moderation, and that would imply an awful lot of work in the build up to an event. And we actually, I mean, we're talking 10 years ago, started to use online tools. We were using cloud systems 10 years ago to moderate student work, and all teachers had oversight of all students' work and marking. At any point that the marking was online, students could see their feedback, students could see their progress, and teachers could see how we were marking each other's work, so that there was moderation going on throughout the year. So we didn't have any pinch points of book scrutinies or any of that. And it, we're talking 10 years ago here, and it had a huge impact. And the technology has improved now to make that even easier. I think to David's point about Tess doing a survey and saying that technology hasn't had an impact, I would say that technology alone makes no impact whatsoever. You don't give a computer to someone and expect them to be able to learn how to teach with it. I think teachers have done an absolutely admirable job in the last 3 months, moving things to a system that many of them may not have ever had any training on, but training is the critical thing. The technology alone will do nothing. The technology is a platform that teachers have to understand how to use. And I think that on the back of this, it needs to be a strategic approach in all schools. And I think that's my role as training future teachers, to get them to understand why you use the technology in the first place and the impact it can have, whether we're face-to-face with students in the classroom or whether those students are at a distance from us. Because all the things we've talked about here, the shy child in the classroom not wanting to put their hand up, if we go back to face-to-face, we exclude that child if we take away the thing that they might have benefited from in the last 3 months, which is an alternative place to ask a question, an alternative way to demonstrate their knowledge and understanding. So in short, training is absolutely essential at this point to look at new approaches.
Very good. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on any of those questions? And then we'll do one more round of questions before we have to finish.
Yeah, I was just going to say two things really. First, in terms of quality assurance, I actually think your quality assurance in some ways is better, because in our school we have our director of learnings who are actually added to all of our teachers' teams. So where in the past they might select, a brilliant set of books to be monitored, now you've got the director of learning is actually there, able to see it in front of them, and added to it. And actually the teacher is arguably more conscious of what they are delivering, because they know that someone else is monitoring their teams. Not in a, we're not like that in a Big Brother sort of way at all. Big Brother-ish, yeah. But yeah, but I think it has actually improved it in that sense. And both Alison and I, we both have sons who are in year 9, and I found that my son in particular has actually responded better to e-learning, because whereas in the past he might be a little bit distracted when he's in school, but at home, because he's able, for example, in his chemistry lesson, to actually stop the lesson and go back and have a look at it and go back over, he's actually you know, he's got on better with his learning than he ever has before when he was in school. And that's not, you know, and we have been, as a team, we've been so impressed with our staff and with their e-learning. I cannot fault the provision that my son has had in year 9. It's been very impressive.
And I think going on from there, looking at the feedback I've had from year 12, they've actually preferred the e-learning on the Teams because they have a record of the lesson. So whereas in normal situations, they're in the classroom and they have the lesson and then they go home that night and they try to do follow-on work from it, and they've forgotten maybe an element of what was being said, the fact that they've all recorded, they can then just go and listen to it again and have that lesson repeated at home as often as they need. And so certainly the more motivated and engaged year 12 students, but I would say for all students, and I think when Ethne introduced at the start and said about the percentages of students that were engaged, I would certainly say that we've got a larger percentage of engagement from the boys from doing online learning than we have when they've been in school. So that's certainly something we'd want to take forward and look at how we can continue that and continue to engage them when they do return back to school.
Thank you. Matthew, you wanted to comment on that?
Just one small point, really, I suppose, because we're talking about e-learning, but also I think there's that opportunity to explore what the role of the teacher is, because we will all agree that face-to-face there is still an absolute critical need for it, and I don't think any of us are agreeing that we move everything online, and so just kind of raise that point at this point that I speak kind of on behalf of everyone, that we're not advocates for, you know, put schools on in the cloud, because there is an absolute need for face-to-face. But what does face-to-face look like, and what do we do, and what is the role of the teacher?
Understood. Helen, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, just in agreement, and to say, I think actually when blended learning is appropriately used, it can benefit face-to-face teaching, because it can make it more productive time, because you're doing less of the old sage on the stage style, as you described, where you're the deliverer of knowledge and the students are gathering that knowledge themselves. They're getting that sense of discovery, and so the lesson becomes collaborative. And we've heard a lot of feedback from schools that have worked in that way, saying that actually the contact time we do have now, it might be less contact time, but it's more productive and it's more valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, the sage on the stage bit, one of the bits of feedback I've had from some teachers is they've, a bit like you said, this has been very empowering for a lot of young people. But one of the things that one teacher said is the child who is very, very attentive, who very academically able, who benefits from a teacher just explaining stuff and loves listening to the expert, this actually allows you to be able to do that. It's not like we're dismissing the sage on the sage on the stage. It might be that, you know, if I know a lot about, I'm an English literature teacher by background, I could do a 10-minute introduction to Shakespeare, which, as Matthew is saying, you could watch in your own time, you could watch over and over, you could put subtitles onto it. It actually makes more accessible a style of learning which may have been slightly alienating in person in the classroom, in a sense. Helen?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think what we do is we take teachers and we sort of digitize their lessons. So we are, if you like, the biggest supporters of making those lessons, making that teacher explanation available at any time. So the student shouldn't have to wait until they go into school to be able to listen to a teacher explain something. If they're stuck on their homework, they should be able to press play and instantly get their teacher to explain it to them whenever they need it. And that's I think what lots of schools are offering.
And at the risk of being unduly pretentious, and I am just pretentious, but unduly pretentious, it seems to me that what these things have done is to democratize stuff which an expert used to have to be able to do. So in other words, those of you ASCL members will know that we now do a daily bulletin to members. I basically stick it on the pile of books over here and speak into that, and then it's uploaded. It's easier for us if we've got the confidence and a little bit of technical knowledge to do stuff that would have been unthinkable or you would have had to spend a lot of money on in the past. And I think that then comes down to quality of leadership in the school. which makes opportunities to be able to do that, sees that as part of professional development, and allows people to make mistakes with it. That sometimes you will do a video and think that's terrible, you know, I'll forget about it. Okay, I'm going to just give a final round of questions. Faye says, really interesting, thank you for a great presentation this afternoon. She says that what she finds is that some students have been confident chatting via online lessons compared to in the classroom, which is what we described. We've found the opposite. They're happy with the chat function, but they actually lack the confidence to join in via audio. And I guess what she's implying, that could make it a more passive experience for youngsters. So if it's something you wanted to say in terms of how do we develop skills so that you're not just saying, well, that kid was always a shy kid, therefore we'll just assume they're always going to be shy. How do you actually develop some of that confidence, I think, is the implication of that. Secondly, Hugh says, that notion of engagement, how do you actually know whether a child is truly engaging with the work or whether it just appears to be doing that? And as he says, I'm someone who's a huge fan of this, but could it be a kind of superficial level of engagement there? So you might want to comment on that. Joe, again, talks about recovery curriculum. There's been lots of talk of having a recovery curriculum. Is that the right way of framing what we've got in the future? Or is this actually a completely different kind of curriculum in the future? Added to which, Catherine, my last one, talks about her being an early years teacher, and she's saying a lot of what I listened to you talking about is what we would take for granted in early years, that you don't compartmentalize this stuff. It's blending all of that stuff in the classroom. You're now blending it in different ways. So there's lots of stuff which is significantly about learning itself there. And let's just have that as a kind of final reflection before I then wrap this up. And I apologize to those people whose questions I didn't get to. Anybody want to just kick us off with a reflection on any of the things we've just said? I'll start with Ethna, then, and then come to Matthew.
Yeah, I think you know, the last couple of questions in particular to pick up. I mean, one about how there is a lot of this stuff already in the system, I think is correct, and I don't think what we're saying here today is that this is all new to everyone. However, the further into the accountability system that we get, I think the risk is that we become much more narrow in terms of how we translate that in the classroom, and we become much less creative and innovative in how we look over our shoulders and worry about performance in a very narrow set of outcomes. And I think that what that does then is it tends to limit our understanding of what knowledge is and our definition of knowledge by pushing it towards an exam outcome only, which is not actually the only knowledge that our children and our learners need in order to become productive in the 21st century. So I would answer that from that point of view. The other thing I would pick up from the previous conversation is that business of equality and equity and levelling the playing field, where we have children who are disadvantaged, that 40% that Fulham talks about, for example, and the numbers of children we know have been left behind, but others who have gained other skills. So it's not to work on a deficit model only, but where we've got children who have got disabilities or vulnerabilities or have got dyslexia or who have got any number of things, where the technology is used correctly, it can actually be a release mechanism for all of us to understand that actually they shouldn't be defined by what they can't do, but they should be released into a world of what they can do and be recognised for that. So that's where I would pitch in the last conversation. Thank you.
And Esther, you will remember this because you've been part of our Apple project. There was a PhD student who was essentially introduced to us by Apple, who had been so severely dyslexic that the traditional education model had left her feeling essentially suicidal. And suddenly when she found that the technical devices she was using, her iPad and stuff like that, could actually read stuff to her that she couldn't read for herself. Well, there she is as a PhD student. I think one of the most liberating bits of all of this is the way in which we're saying that learning doesn't just have to be for those who did do the exams and did well in an exam system, which is what you reference. We'll come to Matthew, and then essentially I'm just going to do the rounds for each of you to have a final comment, and then we're going to wrap it up. So Matthew, to you.
Yeah, I was going to first of all talk to the shyness point, the engagement point. I think don't always consider that a shy student isn't engaged. Introverts, and I speak for myself here, I have benefited probably more from being online the last 3 months because I struggle in social situations. That doesn't mean I'm not engaged. If I don't join in a chat, that doesn't mean I'm not engaged. Sometimes I actually learn quite a lot by listening to others and sitting quietly. And I might be staring out the window at that point or doodling on a piece of paper, but I am engaged. And so I think we can be all quick to judge that if someone doesn't have a loud voice, that means they're not paying attention. I think actually what we see is a lot of students that just learn in different ways. So the second kind of point, and actually this builds on what you were just talking about there in terms of if you allow choice of how children can express themselves, if we move away from writing things down in books, what I've seen hugely in my own development as an individual is how technology has given me a voice to do things in ways that before had to always be written. I ventured into the world of online blogging when I first started exploring technology, and then people would critique my spelling, and actually, do you know what, judge what I'm saying, not how I'm saying it. And I know I'm not underestimating literacy as being a key thing. What I'm saying is sometimes we're all too quick to judge the literacy skill of someone as opposed to the words they're actually using. And I suppose technology now, I do a lot of my stuff through video because I can speak quite clearly, and you can judge me eloquently in how I say those things or if I pronounce something wrong, but fundamentally people hear what you're saying and don't judge what the way you're saying it. So I think in that sense, where I've seen that the absolute growth of Apple technology is in it does absolutely give children a voice. And to the point on early learning, I just kind of want to leave with one final question. I was talking to an early learning practitioner in Newport, and she said that the reason that they use iPads is because you get to see the world through the eyes of the child when they go exploring with an iPad, and when they make things, you see the world through their eyes. And I think that's what I was alluding to before, that an iPad is not a device which blocks the world around you, because the second you turn the camera on, it's actually your way of sharing what you see and what you hear and what you think about things just by tapping record. So yeah, I think there's huge opportunities here to learn from our early years practitioners in how they do engage and cross barriers of school days.
Okay, I'm going to go Helen, Hannah, Alison for just a final thought, and then I'm conscious that we've overrun a bit, so then I'm going to wrap it up. So Helen, over to you.
Yeah, Stuart, you asked a question about the recovery curriculum and whether that's the right way of framing it. And we've had a lot of feedback from teachers saying they don't like the negative language that's being used to sort of catch up, and students who have fallen behind, this very negative way of looking at it. And I think maybe recovery curriculum, I understand where it's coming from, but it inherently suggests that there's a sickness, there's a problem that has to be healed, and that there will be a finite cutoff point when we say, that's us, we're recovered, everyone's sorted. And so maybe we should think about it as the transformative curriculum, or a curriculum that will hopefully transform what we've learned and build on that and keep those gains that there has undoubtedly been in the education sector, and learn from those as well. The other question that came in is around reinventing the wheel, if you like, and not necessarily saying to teachers that to do blended learning, they need to be creating huge amounts of additional work for themselves. I think there's sometimes a misconception when people talk about online learning that, okay, so all of my staff have now got to start generating online lessons and videos and so on. And that can be really creative and really enjoyable for a lot of teachers, but it doesn't suit everyone. And so I think it's just to recognize that a lot of teachers who are comfortable with their voice or their lessons being online are making them available. And so if we can collaborate, not just within our school, which is what I described earlier, but also collaborate nationally and look at platforms and ways of sharing between schools across departments, I think it would reduce maybe some of that that fear that some teachers might have, that they don't have time to create all of this content that's needed, but also improve the teaching that's going on by learning from what others might be doing. Like if Matthew's creating a fantastic video, if that's available online or if it's available through a platform like ours, it can really benefit teachers. So they're not reinventing the wheel, I think is key, that other people have already done that. It's something that we've already got.
Yeah, okay, thank you. If we can just ask Hannah and then Alison just for a final 30-second reflection from each of you, if you could. So Hannah, over to you.
Yeah, in terms of, as I said, I think the idea is to focus on the positive and looking at, essentially this is a webinar, isn't it, looking at blended learning. And I think going forward, we can certainly see ways that we can use technology that will enhance and engage, for example, those shy children, or as we mentioned as well, Alison mentioned, particularly boys, who I think very often don't want to be seen, to answer questions in class or to contribute, whereas when it goes online, they're very, and I think children are so, they use their phones all the time, and that's a technology that they feel really comfortable with. And as I said, I've certainly seen that with my son since we've been in lockdown, where it's really benefited him.
Yeah, and I just think we have to sort of realise we're in an exciting, pivotal point in education, not only coming out of what we've learned through the pandemic, but with the curriculum for Wales coming in. And it's a real opportunity to really assess what we've done, where we use technology, and how we can progress so that we can increase the motivation and engagement of all our learners, from the most able down to the least able. And I think it's an exciting time for us to reassess.
Great note of optimism there, and I'm glad you referenced curriculum for Wales there, because what we see when we look to Wales is that real ambition on behalf of all the learners in Wales, and politicians who are determined to make it happen. I finish just with this thought, which you'll know, Douglas Adams, who's come up with 3 rules. 1, anything that is in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary, and is just a natural part of the way the world works. Rule 2, anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is new and exciting and revolutionary, and you can probably get a career in it. 3, anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. So one of the things which we've got to do is to make sure that we are preparing our young people for a very different world where technology is rooted into it. Thanks so much for your contributions, all of you, today. It's been really stimulating discussion. If you like the webinars, then remember we've got our Team ASCL webinars. We've got a whole suite of around 40 of them, all kinds of different things, some of them technical, how to do finances, how to build a curriculum and stuff. Some of them preparing you if you're taking on a headship, etc. And if you are taking on a headship, really would like to invite you to join us. More than 160 people so far at our head teachers conference. It's in 2 parts. The 7th of July is some national figures talking about the big picture that you're going to be dealing with as a new head, particularly in these strange times. Then from the 13th of July, some much more granular opportunities to talk to people who've been heads themselves for a while, telling you the things they wish they'd known when they started the job. Do have a look at our website, and we'd love to see you at either of those, the Team ASCL webinars or the New Heads Conference. And from me and the panel, thank you very much. Let's hand over to the queen of the webinar, the Uberführer, Annette Wade.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you so much to all of the panel today, and a big thank you to our team at ASCL Cymru for putting today together and making it all possible and hosting that. We really appreciate that, and for inviting all ASCL members to join. Thank you all for your feedback, some fantastic feedback and ideas that you're sharing about what you're doing in schools and colleges, and also for the questions. Sorry we didn't get to them all. We will be going through them, and where we can, we'll be updating our guidance on the ASCL website, so look out for that. The recording of this session will be coming out tomorrow. Please feel free to share that with colleagues. A few people are already saying that they would like the recording to share with the rest of their leadership team on Monday. So that's fantastic. We'll get that out to you as quickly as we can tomorrow. But thank you so much for joining us, and take care, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Bye.